The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Hi everyone, Dr. Clark here. Today we're going to discuss the basic units of energy, or just really what is energy? How does the word energy apply to the field of biology? And, just some general information about energy. Now, to some of you, energy might represent something like this. Wind turbines, solar panels, maybe you could put a coal plant here, natural gas field. Maybe energy to you is electricity. I want you to think about it when we're talking about energy in biology. Yes, electricity is a type of energy, but there are other types of energy that we need to discuss and that we will go over and that, apply to living systems. And that often is this energy over here. This is often what we call chemical energy or bond energy. This molecule right here, here in this, in this form, it's the same as this line form. It's the same molecule. This is ATP, or what's called adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine is an adenine bound to a sugar. In this case, it's bound to a ribose sugar. So this is adenine, this is a ribose sugar. And then triphosphate is 3 phosphate groups that are attached to the sugar. These 3 phosphate groups are very important. We'll come back to the concept of ATP. We're going to cover a little bit on how ATP is formed, and then the uses of ATP. How do you break down ATP and what is it used for? So when we talk about energy, I just want to make sure that you understand that the word energy doesn't necessarily mean electricity. In some cases, when we're talking about maybe these systems, solar or wind or even natural gas or hydro, then we're talking, when we say energy, then we're talking electricity. When we're talking about living systems, however, energy often is this form here, this ATP. Okay? All right, so the flow of energy is important to all of life. Because a lot of organisms on this planet do not have the capability of creating their own energy or converting their own energy, they require other organisms to do it for them, us included. Those organisms that cannot convert their own energy, cannot do chemosynthesis or photosynthesis, those organisms are called heterotrophs. Organisms that can or have the capability of converting their own energy either from solar, from photons, through the process of photosynthesis, or from chemicals through the process of chemosynthesis. Those organisms are called autotrophs. We'll come back and discuss the role between the two, but the role in general has to do with the flow of energy. Energy moving from one source to another and what's occurring with that energy. Well, let's talk about some definitions real quick. So energy is the ability to do work. It consists of 2 states. Most of you probably have heard of these states of energy. The first one we're going to talk about is potential energy. Potential energy is stored energy. So stored energy can be stored in multiple forms. For the purpose of biology, the form that we most often talk about is what we call chemical energy or bond energy. This is the energy that is utilized to bond two molecules or 10 molecules or 1,000 molecules together. It's the energy that's holding molecules together. That's stored energy, bond energy, chemical energy, i.e. potential energy. When those bonds are broken, when those bonds are, dissolved and the energy is released, that energy then can drive work, and it can drive work in the form of kinetic energy or energy of motion. So you got two states. You have stored up energy, that's potential energy, and then you actually have energy that's being utilized for motion, and that's kinetic energy. And like I discussed a little bit before, this flow of energy through living things or for living things is really just the process of taking potential energy, often in the form of chemical energy, converting it into kinetic energy or energy of motion. It's that cycle or that movement of energy from one form to another that we're really going to discuss in this lecture, that process of moving energy from one form to another. You can think of it as a ball or as a rock on top of a hill. When the rock or the ball is just sitting on top of the hill, like in this picture here, that's potential energy. We could replace this individual and ball with a guy on a bicycle, with a car. It doesn't matter. You could replace it with a candy bar. It makes no difference. Those are all potential energies. Now, the one thing that I want to make sure that you understand is majority of potential energies, they need a little energy to get that potential energy to break down. So they need a little initial energy, either in the form of a push, in the form of a pedal, in the form of, chewing. Something needs to be able to be utilized to break that connection, either the connection with the ground and start the effect of gravity on that ball or that bike, or the effect of the bound up energy in a candy bar, and a piece of meat and some salad, whatever it is, to break down that material to start that process of breaking bonds. Either way, a little bit of energy has to go into the system. When the energy goes into the system, then that energy can be utilized in the form of motion energy or kinetic energy. Now, as long as the system is not supplying more energy than it's getting out, then it is a net gain system. But in some cases, we'll talk about some cases where the amount of energy going in is not equal to or greater than the amount of energy coming out. These would be net loss systems. We'll come back to these and see how they're not sustainable, especially when we talk about food pyramids or we talk about food webs and things like that. Right? We'll come back to that in a later date. All right, so there are lots of different forms of energy. Chemical energy, photons, again, friction or movement-based energy. There's lots of different forms of energy out there. But one of the nice things, at least from a human standpoint, from the ability to calculate energy, it's important that all the energy sources, they all can be converted into heat. By converting things into heat, it's a convenient way to measure how much energy a system has, or how much energy an object emits, or how much energy a chemical bond, how much potential energy a chemical bond would have. This is what we call thermodynamics. So thermodynamics is the study of that energy transfer or heat changes. Okay, so one way in which we can get at thermodynamics, or the study of energy and heat change, is by using this apparatus, the Bohm calorimeter. And the Bohm calorimeter, it was used often. It's not used as often now because we have a kind of rule of thumbs that we go by. But it was used often to get that rule of thumb, to get that deductive reasoning initially. And that is to take a sample of food, take a sample of whatever you're interested in, knowing how many calories are in that food. You take that, you put it in the sample, which is inside the Bohm cell, and then you light it on fire, and it burns inside that Bohm cell. And that Bohm cell transfers heat to water. That is how we measure calories. Okay? So 1 calorie is equal to the amount of energy needed to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Okay, so 1 calorie is the measurement of taking 1 kilogram of water and raising its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So let's say we're interested in how many calories a Big Mac has. So we'd put the Big Mac in there, we'd light it on fire, and we'd see what the change in temperature of the water is. That will give you how many calories that burger has. Okay. So now I said that we used to use this. Now often we don't use this unless it's a new, maybe it's a new type of food, or it's new synthetic material, or something like that. But for majority of things that we know how many carbohydrates are in it, or how much protein's in it, how much fat's in it, then we just use the rule that's called the 4-4-9 rule. That there is 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram of protein, 9 calories per gram of fat. So if you know how many different grams, or what the amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fats is inside a food sample, then you can use that general rule of thumb to convert it over. And we'll come back and talk about protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And we're going to talk about the energy that's associated with them, and that's where that caloric energy comes into play. Again, how much energy it takes to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree of Celsius, that's a calorie. And it's really coming from this calculation, or this, Bohm calorimeter will allow us to calculate that and get that rule that we now use of 4-4-9. All right, so we can also look at energy from the basis of how do those autotrophs get their original energy. And for the most part, most organisms that are autotrophs utilize the process of photosynthesis. Now again, I mentioned at the beginning that they could do something called chemosynthesis, and this often occurs in areas where there is limited light or no light. Next to thermal vents in the ocean, a lot of organisms would utilize chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. Sometimes in things like hot springs that might be deep, and in the deeper part of those hot springs where there might be a lot of different chemicals, that the process of chemosynthesis is present. Okay, but by and large, the majority of autotrophs are utilizing photons from the sun to start building chemical energy, to convert that energy from the sun into usable energy in their system, in their body. That usable energy normally begins in the form of what we call carbohydrates. Again, we'll come back and talk about this, but it's representing potential energy or stored energy. Right? So the photon is being captured. The energy from the photon is being utilized to combine monomers or small molecules to form polymers or large molecules. And like we were talking about in basic chemistry, a chemical reaction is that formation of bonds, or even the breaking or the disformation of bonds. So that is how chemical reactions work. Either you're forming bonds or you're breaking bonds. Now, the nice thing about this, or the interesting thing about this, is to form a bond, you need energy. To break a bond, you receive energy. So energy that's, coming free from the sun can be utilized to form bonds, and then energy that we need to run our bodies can then, break down those molecules and get energy from the breaking of those bonds. All right, so let's look at the law of thermodynamics, or some laws of thermodynamics. Remember, thermodynamics is the study of that heat change, or that energy to heat exchange. So there are some universal laws of thermodynamics. Okay, the first one is, and most of you already know this, that the total amount of energy in the universe remains constant. So just like we talked about a little bit about water, the total amount of water on the planet is the same amount of water as there's always been on the planet. The same thing goes for energy. The total amount of energy in the universe, remember, we're getting energy from outside our planet, but the total amount of energy in the universe remains constant. In other words, energy is not created nor destroyed. Okay? For that matter, there's really nothing that is created or destroyed. It's just changing forms. So when we talk about carbohydrates and the formation of carbohydrates, going from glucose to combining a bunch of glucose molecules to make cellulose, and then let's talk about an organism that can break cellulose down, it doesn't mean that it's destroying cellulose. It doesn't mean that it's destroying glucose molecules. It's converting it back to a more simple form. And then it's digesting that material. And the byproducts of that digestion is going to be energy. Some of that energy is going to be released as heat. Another byproduct or waste product of that is going to be water. That water is, again, the same water molecules occurring on the planet forever. Okay, so that water molecule will be, leave the system as waste, either through sweat, urine, saliva, something. Okay? It will be removed from the system. And carbon dioxide. Right? Respiration will remove another waste product in carbon dioxide. Well, what do plants need to recreate that glucose molecule and then recreate that cellulose molecule? Carbon dioxide, water, and energy photons. Okay? So that energy is not created nor destroyed. It just changes form. Now, the other big piece that we're going to talk about quite a bit in the future is that conversion. Okay? That law of thermodynamics, again, energy is not created nor destroyed. It just changes form. But here's the kicker with it. When you change form, when you go from one form to another form, energy is lost. It's lost to the environment as heat. Okay, if you want to test this, or if you want to get an idea of this, sit in a chair for 15-20 minutes, get up, put your hand on the chair. You've lost a lot of heat to that chair. Well, that's part of that thermodynamics. While you're sitting there, you're converting food energy, chemical energy, into work energy, into kinetic energy to move muscles and work your organs and work your brain, fire nerves. In that process of converting that energy, you're releasing heat to the environment. Just happens to be if you're sitting on something, that something is going to absorb that heat, and you're going to be able to noticeably feel a heat change or a temperature change in that object. Right? But this is occurring constantly all over your body. You're releasing that heat into the atmosphere. All right, another law is the second law of thermodynamics, which is the entropy law, or in other words, disorder is continuously increasing. Okay, so entropy is a measure of disorder in a system. Disorder meaning the breaking down of the system. The second law is basically entropy increases. So some of you probably think about this when, maybe when you've just cleaned your bedroom or whatever it might be, you just cleaned your car, and then over time, it again looks like this. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that that's how entropy works, because if you left your bedroom in this state and you left and you came back in 30 years, entropy would have taken place. Disorder would have taken place. Spontaneously, things would start to deteriorate. Things would start to break down. You leave it for 100 years, it's still going to be breaking down. And the reason for that is it's really a great component of our planet and our universe, is that order or tidiness or bonds that have formed, they take energy to keep that. It takes energy to maintain organization. Right? This is a great thing. Otherwise, if you didn't have energy to maintain organization, maintain cell structure, maintain, an organism's makeup, then you would never have decomposition. When organisms die, because there's no new energy coming in, that material starts to deteriorate over time. This is a great thing. Death isn't necessarily a great thing, but the process is a great thing, because energy gets to change form. It's not always bound up. It's not solid, bound up, and needs a outside source to break it down. Now, if you go back, and I was talking about potential energy and kinetic energy, and I said that potential energy often needs a little push. Well, in technicality, it doesn't actually need a little push. Time would eventually allow for that potential energy to break down. It just happens to be that our systems don't wait that time, because we would starve to death otherwise. And so we have to apply a little bit of energy to get a large energy return. The same thing goes for this entropy, is if your system is going to maintain organization or order, it requires energy. All right, so chemical reactions. Remember, chemical reactions is either the forming of bonds or the breaking of bonds. But there are two components to every chemical reaction. There are reactants or substrates, and then there is a product. So you have multiple substrates coming together, forming a bond to form a product. You can then have a product which is going to be broken down to form substrates or reactants. Two kinds of chemical reactions. There are chemical reactions which we call endergonic. Endergonic chemical reactions need more energy. They need energy to form products. So you have to apply energy in order for that product to form. The product itself will have an abundance of energy, okay? But you have to supply energy to get the product to form. Exergonic reactions, on the other hand, they react spontaneously. So your product itself will spontaneously break up. The bonds will spontaneously dissolve or break, releasing energy. Okay, so endergonic reactions take energy to occur. Exergonic reactions release energy while they're occurring. And like I stated before, with potential energy and kinetic energy, for the most part, as a rule of thumb, every chemical reaction requires an initial input of energy. Pushing the rock, chewing the food, okay, pedaling the bike. These are all initial requirements of energy being into the system, put into the system, in order for energy to be released from that system. That energy that needs to be applied is called activation energy. And for the process or the purpose of really biology, that activation energy is what initiates chemical reactions. It's what initiates either the bond being broken down or the bond being formed. Okay, so it's often that process of destabilizing the chemical bonds. Okay, it can be destabilizing the chemical bonds so new bonds can form. It can be destabilizing the chemical bonds so the bonds fall apart and energy is released. But all of them need a little bit of activation energy. Now, as you lower the amount of activation energy needed, the more likely something is going to react spontaneously, okay, or immediately. Now, you guys have probably learned about catalysts before, maybe in a biology class in high school, possibly even in middle school. And often the term catalyst is associated with speeding up a reaction. So catalysts make reactions go faster than they would normally go. But I don't want you to just know that the reaction is going faster. I want you to know what the catalyst is actually doing. what that catalyst is doing is it's changing the amount of activation energy needed. So here are your two types of chemical reactions. You have an endergonic reaction. Here's your reactants. You're trying to form a product. So you must supply energy. In this case, you're supplying quite a bit of energy to form that product. Okay. In this case, here's an exergonic reaction. Again, reactants, products. In this case, you might have to supply energy. Maybe it's even the same amount of energy here as the exergonic reaction, but once you get to a breaking point, then energy is released when the product is formed. And you can see you have a lot more energy being released than energy that went in. In this case, this is a net loss of energy until you break the product. Okay? In this case, there's a net gain of energy. Okay? The energy is being released into the system. So what do catalysts do? Catalysts change that amount of activation energy. So uncatalyzed, remember, you had to supply a bunch of energy to get to the breaking point, and then the product could form and energy be released. In this case, you just have to supply a little bit of energy, and you get into that energy release and product formation. Okay, so catalyzed reactions decrease the amount of activation energy needed. That's why the reaction happens faster. So you can think of this from an example. Let's say you have some hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide, or 2H2O2, is often used to clean cuts, maybe to whiten your teeth, lots of different things that people use hydrogen peroxide for. Well, hydrogen peroxide has a catalyst called catalase that drives this reaction, that decreases the amount of activation energy. And you go from hydrogen peroxide to the product, and the product is water and oxygen. But can hydrogen peroxide break down all on its own? Sure. Take a cup of hydrogen peroxide and leave it on your counter, and over time, enough energy through photons and light, etc., will come into the system, destable the bonds will eventually break, and the product will eventually become water, and the oxygen will have left the cup into the atmosphere. So again, it still will occur. It just, by utilizing an enzyme that we call catalase, that enzyme makes this reaction occur faster because it lowers the amount of energy needed to break down hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. And we'll look at more examples of this, and we'll do a lab on this as we progress. Next time, we're going to look at proteins. So remember, we just discussed energy, potential energy. And there are really three kind of potential energies that our body utilizes constantly: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. We're going to talk about a fourth one, nucleic acids, which are utilized as information-carrying molecules also. Okay? So 4 biomolecules: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, are coming up next.